September 1580. A small battered ship limps into Plymouth harbour after nearly 3 years at sea. Her hull is scarred, her crew is skeletal, but her hold is packed with plundered Spanish silver and exotic spices from the other side of the world. The captain steps ashore and asks a fisherman whether the Queen is still alive. That ship is the Golden Hind. She left England as part of a fleet of 5 vessels. She came home alone. Where are the other 4 ships? That question doesn't have a clean answer. The records are incomplete. Some accounts contradict each other, and Francis Drake himself was not always eager to advertise what had happened out there. What we know is pieced together from logs, letters, survivor testimony, and Spanish interrogation reports of men Drake left behind. Certainty runs out quickly in this story. The gaps are part of it. What we can say with confidence is this. Somewhere between the coast of England and the far side of the globe, a fleet dissolved. Ships were lost to storms. One was turned back deliberately. Men died of disease and violence and exposure. At least one was wrecked. One captain was put on trial thousands of miles from any courtroom, convicted and executed on a bleak South American beach. The voyage that history remembers as a triumph left wreckage across 2 oceans. And yet Drake completed the circumnavigation. He became only the 2nd captain in history to lead a voyage around the entire world, and the first to survive it himself. He returned with enough stolen Spanish treasure to pay off the English crown's entire foreign debt and still turn a profit. Queen Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his own ship. Spain demanded his head. He got a statue instead, but the legend obscures the human arithmetic. 5 ships and roughly 164 men set out from Plymouth in December 1577. 1 ship and around 56 men returned. That's not a footnote. That's the actual story, and most of it has never been told as clearly as it deserves. This is the voyage in full, from the planning rooms in London, where powerful men weighed profit against provocation, to the cramped and rotting quarters where sailors debated mutiny in whispers, to the moment Drake stood alone in the Pacific and had to decide what to do with a mission that had already cost more than anyone admitted. We'll follow each ship, trace what happened to the crews, and try to answer the question the official celebrations quietly ignored. Why did only 1 ship come home? Some of those answers are satisfying. Some are uncomfortable. A few are still genuinely unknown. Drake was brilliant, ruthless, lucky, and not entirely honest about what he did and why. The men who sailed with him were desperate, skilled, frightened, and occasionally mutinous. The voyage succeeded in ways England wanted to publicise, and failed in ways England preferred to bury. What you end up with, when you look at all of it, is something stranger and more interesting than the clean heroic story that survived. A fleet that left in secrecy, unravelled under pressure, and shrank to a single ship crossing the Pacific with stolen gold and almost no backup plan. 5 ships left. 1 came back. Here's what happened to the other 4, and why this story is bigger than the ship that survived it. To understand why Drake sailed, you have to understand the world England was living in during the 1570s. And that world was dominated almost suffocatingly by Spain. The Habsburg Empire under Philip II controlled more of the globe than any power in history had managed before it. Spain held vast stretches of South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. Portuguese territory, which Philip would inherit outright in 1580, added Africa, Brazil, and the spice routes of the Indian Ocean. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, had essentially divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal in a straight line on the map, with the blessing of the Pope. England hadn't been invited to that arrangement, and Elizabeth's Protestant kingdom had no intention of honouring it. The problem was that England was, by comparison, a minor power. Its navy was capable but small. Its treasury was under chronic strain. Open war with Spain was not a realistic option in the 1570s, partly because England couldn't afford it, and partly because Elizabeth was still trying to manage the diplomatic relationship carefully, keeping Philip uncertain about her intentions. What England could do, and increasingly did, was operate in the grey zone between commerce and piracy, between diplomacy and sabotage. English captains raided Spanish shipping in the Atlantic, while the Queen officially denied knowledge of their activities. It was deniable aggression, and both sides understood the game even when neither would name it openly. Drake was not new to any of this. By the time he was tapped for the circumnavigation, he had already built a career in exactly that grey zone. His early experience came through his cousin John Hawkins, who ran slaving expeditions between West Africa and the Spanish Caribbean in the 1560s, selling enslaved people to Spanish colonists who were technically forbidden from buying them but were hungry for labour regardless. Drake sailed on at least 2 of these voyages and learned the Atlantic in conditions that required constant improvisation, negotiation under threat, and the management of violence. He learned how Spanish colonial defences worked, where they were thin, and how colonial officials made decisions when the choices were all bad. Then came San Juan de Ulua in 1568. Hawkins and Drake were sheltering a damaged fleet in a Mexican port when a Spanish treasure fleet arrived. What followed was a violent confrontation that left most of the English ships destroyed or captured. Drake escaped on a vessel called the Judith and made it back to England. Hundreds of English sailors did not. For Drake, the episode was not just a military defeat. It was a personal account that he intended for the rest of his life to settle. Between 1570 and 1573, he made multiple raids on the Spanish Main, operating with small crews and an audacity that became notorious. In 1573, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot with a small group of men and a band of cimarrones, enslaved Africans who had escaped Spanish control and had their own reasons to damage Spanish infrastructure. From a ridge in the jungle, he became one of the first Englishmen to see the Pacific Ocean. He stared at it, and according to accounts from the time, he prayed to God to give him the chance to sail an English ship on that sea. 3 years later, someone gave him a plan to do exactly that. The men behind the circumnavigation project were a small circle of investors and courtiers, including Christopher Hatton, John Hawkins himself, and almost certainly Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, and the architect of much of England's covert foreign policy. The Queen almost certainly knew about it, though how much she knew and how directly she authorised it was deliberately kept ambiguous. The plan called for Drake to sail through the Strait of Magellan at the tip of South America, which Spain officially regarded as a closed waterway, and raid the Pacific coast, which Spain considered entirely safe. No English ship had ever operated there. The Spanish had no Pacific fleet worth the name because they had never needed one. The western coast of South America was lined with ports full of silver from the mines of Peru, loaded onto ships with almost no defensive precautions because the threat had simply never materialized. Drake's mission was to materialize that threat. The formal cover story for the expedition, used when anyone asked, was that it was a trading voyage to Alexandria. This was barely plausible and probably not expected to fool serious scrutiny. What it gave the Crown was the ability to deny involvement if things went wrong. If Drake was captured, he would be a pirate acting on his own initiative. If he succeeded, the Queen could decide how much credit to claim. This was standard Elizabethan operating procedure in the undeclared war with Spain, and it gave the voyage its peculiar double nature from the beginning. It was simultaneously a state operation and an operation the state could disown. The investors expected profit. They were backing a privateer raid on a scale never attempted before, and the potential returns were enormous if Drake could reach the Pacific and hit the treasure routes before Spain knew what was happening. For Drake personally, the voyage was also a chance to settle old debts, literal and figurative, against a Spanish empire that had humiliated him at San Juan de Ulua and dominated a world he thought England had as much right to inhabit as anyone. For England more broadly, the voyage was a test of something harder to quantify. Could an English captain operate globally? Could England project power beyond the Atlantic and into the spaces Spain considered sealed? The geopolitical argument was as important as the plunder. If Drake could cross the Pacific and return, he would prove that Spanish dominance of the world's oceans was not a permanent fact, but a temporary condition that mattered in ways that went far beyond whatever silver he brought home. So the expedition that left Plymouth in December 1577 carried all of this with it: personal grievance, investor greed, strategic ambition, and the Queen's careful, deniable blessing. It was a raid dressed as a trading voyage, a national project disguised as a private enterprise, and a direct challenge to the most powerful empire on earth, sent out with 5 ships and a captain who had been planning this moment, in one form or another, for nearly a decade. The 5 ships that left Plymouth in December 1577 were a carefully assembled collection, each chosen for a specific purpose, and together they tell you a great deal about both the ambitions and the anxieties behind the expedition. The flagship was the Pelican, which Drake would rename the Golden Hind mid-voyage in honour of Christopher Hatton, one of the key investors whose family crest featured a golden deer. The Pelican was a galleon of roughly 100 tons, heavily armed for her size, carrying 18 guns. She was the muscle of the fleet, built to fight if necessary and to carry the bulk of whatever the expedition brought home. Drake commanded her personally, and the care he took with her armament reflected his understanding that the Pacific coast of South America was not going to be raided peacefully. The ship was fast enough, manoeuvrable enough, and strong enough to be genuinely dangerous. The Elizabeth, commanded by John Winter, came in at around 80 tons and served as the second fighting vessel. She was solid, well-armed, and crewed by experienced men. Winter himself was a capable officer, the son of a navy administrator, and his presence gave the expedition a degree of institutional credibility and competence that it needed. The relationship between Winter and Drake would prove to be one of the more complicated threads of the voyage. The Marigold was a bark of about 30 tons, smaller and nimbler than the 2 main vessels. Barks of this type were useful for coastal reconnaissance, for getting into shallower waters, and for the kind of fast movement that heavier ships couldn't manage. She was commanded by John Thomas, and she carried a small but functional crew. The Marigold's size, which made her useful in certain conditions, also made her extremely vulnerable in others, and that vulnerability would matter enormously before the voyage was over. The Swan, a flyboat of 50 tons, was the expedition's primary supply vessel. Her job was to carry the provisions, the spare gear, the trade goods, and the additional stores that kept the rest of the fleet operational. Flyboats were workhorses, not fighters, and the Swan's presence in the fleet was an acknowledgement that a voyage of this length required logistical support that the combat vessels couldn't provide on their own. She was commanded by John Chester. The 5th ship, the Christopher, was a small pinnace of about 15 tons. Pinnaces were essential tools of Elizabethan seafaring. They were shallow-drafted, oar-capable vessels that could operate in harbours, rivers and coastal shallows where larger ships couldn't go. They were used for reconnaissance, for landing parties, and for the kind of close-in work that required getting ashore quickly. The Christopher was also designed to be partially disassembled and stored aboard the larger vessels if needed, which gave the expedition flexibility. She was commanded by Thomas More. The fleet's collective tonnage of roughly 275 tons was not enormous by the standards of major naval operations, but it was not a small enterprise either. What made it formidable was the combination of firepower on the Pelican and the Elizabeth, logistical capacity on the Swan, and tactical flexibility provided by the Marigold and the Christopher. The design was coherent and showed serious planning. The crew numbered somewhere between 160 and 170 men, and their composition was deliberate and socially complicated. Drake brought sailors, obviously experienced men who knew the Atlantic and could handle the kind of sailing the voyage demanded. He also brought soldiers, whose role would become increasingly important once the fleet entered Spanish waters. There were gunners, specialists in the operation of the artillery, that gave the Pelican her edge. There were carpenters and ship surgeons, men whose skills were not glamorous, but whose absence would have been catastrophic. There were musicians, which sounds like a luxury, but was in fact a considered choice. Music maintained morale on long voyages in ways that commanders of the period understood practically, not sentimentally. Then there were the gentlemen adventurers, and this group deserves particular attention, because they would become a source of serious trouble. Elizabethan expeditions routinely included men of social standing who were not professional sailors. They were investors, younger sons of good families, men who wanted adventure and expected a share of the profits. Some of them were capable and genuinely useful, others were not, and the friction between gentlemen who considered manual labour beneath them and sailors who were doing the actual work of keeping the ships alive was a structural tension built into the expedition from the start. Drake was acutely aware of this problem and had views about it that he would express, memorably and violently, before the voyage was much older. The most prominent of the gentlemen was Thomas Doughty, a well-connected figure with ties to the court, and his presence aboard would prove to be the single most dangerous element the fleet carried. The supplies loaded onto these ships represented months of planning. There were provisions for an extended voyage: biscuit, salt beef, dried fish, peas and beer in quantities that would need to be carefully managed. There were trade goods, bolts of cloth and metal items intended for use in ports where Drake hoped to negotiate rather than fight. The weapons inventory was substantial, including the cannon on the Pelican and Elizabeth, smaller swivel guns mounted on the gunwales, crossbows, firearms and edged weapons for hand-to-hand fighting. The navigational tools included charts, compasses, hourglasses for measuring time, cross-staffs and astrolabes for measuring latitude, and the accumulated knowledge of the men who knew how to use them. Drake also carried several books and charts related to the Strait of Magellan, some of them obtained through channels that were probably not entirely legitimate, and he had at least one Portuguese pilot aboard whose knowledge of southern waters was considered invaluable. What the fleet's design revealed, if you looked at it honestly, was a mission built for speed and surprise rather than sustained endurance. The supply capacity was real but finite. The combat power was concentrated in 2 ships, which meant that losing either one would significantly diminish the expedition's ability to fight. The smaller vessels gave flexibility but also fragility. It was a fleet optimized for a specific kind of raid, not for an extended campaign, and that optimization would define both the voyage's greatest successes and its most painful losses before the Golden Hind finally made it home. The fleet sailed from Plymouth on the 15th of December 1577, and almost nothing about its departure was what it appeared to be. The official story, the one told to Spanish ambassadors, to curious port officials, to anyone who asked uncomfortable questions, was that Drake was heading for Alexandria, a trading voyage in the Mediterranean, entirely routine, nothing worth examining closely. It was a lie, and most people who mattered probably knew it was a lie, but the lie served its purpose by creating just enough official distance between Elizabeth's court and whatever Drake was actually about to do. The secrecy was not incidental. It was structural. Drake's orders, to whatever extent they existed in written form, have never fully surfaced, and there is strong reason to believe that was deliberate. Elizabeth and her council wanted the freedom to disavow the expedition if it failed or if the diplomatic pressure from Spain became too great. Drake could be a pirate if things went wrong, a privateer operating beyond his mandate. He could only become a hero if things went spectacularly right. The Queen's investment in the voyage, which was real and substantial, was kept off the official books entirely. This was not an oversight. It was the architecture of plausible deniability, built before the first anchor was raised. The men aboard those 5 ships carried this ambiguity with them. Most of the crew understood they were not going to Alexandria. The more experienced sailors almost certainly grasped that they were heading somewhere far more dangerous, somewhere that would require everything the fleet carried in the way of weapons and provisions. But the precise destination remained closely held, and Drake did not volunteer clarity. He operated on a need-to-know basis that served his command, but also meant that much of the crew was being asked to commit to a voyage whose full nature they had not been told. That created a kind of low-level unease that would not take long to surface. The departure itself was almost immediately disrupted. The fleet had barely cleared Plymouth when weather forced the ships back to port. This was not unusual for December sailing in the English Channel, and experienced mariners would have treated it as an annoyance rather than an omen. But the delay extended. The fleet tried again and was beaten back a second time. They sat in port through storms and cold, crews restless, provisions beginning to be consumed without any progress being made. The weeks lost at the outset created a creeping anxiety that early departures from schedule always generate on long-distance voyages, where timing matters enormously and every day's delay in the beginning has compounding consequences further along. It was not until mid-December that the fleet finally managed to clear England properly and begin moving south. By then, some of the edge had already come off the expedition's momentum. Men who had been primed for action had spent weeks waiting. The contrast between the scale of the mission and the unglamorous reality of sitting in harbour nursing provisions and watching the weather was already doing its quiet work on morale. The leadership structure, which looked coherent on paper, was already showing its complications. Drake held command, and his authority was genuine and backed by royal sanction, however unofficial that sanction was. But the presence of Thomas Doughty created a parallel centre of gravity. Doughty was well connected in ways that Drake was not. He had the ear of courtiers. He spoke the language of the gentry, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed his social standing gave him standing within the expedition's hierarchy that pure seamanship could not override. Whether Doughty saw himself as Drake's equal, his partner, or eventually his replacement is a question historians have argued without settling. What is clear is that Doughty began, very early in the voyage, to behave in ways that undermined Drake's authority, and Drake was watching him. The tensions between the gentlemen adventurers and the working sailors were already present before the English coast disappeared behind the fleet. It was not a new problem. It was the same structural tension that had been built into the crew composition from the beginning. But at sea, with no outside authority to appeal to and no escape from the close quarters of shipboard life, structural tensions become personal ones quickly. Sailors who were handling lines, pumping bilges, and doing the exhausting physical work of keeping the ships moving had limited patience for gentlemen who treated them as servants and questioned the orders of men who actually knew what they were doing. The gentlemen, for their part, had their own ideas about hierarchy and were not prepared to set them aside simply because they were at sea. Drake understood this dynamic, and it frightened him in a specific way. He had seen what happened when discipline fractured on long voyages. He had seen what happened when men with connections and grievances had enough time to work on each other's resentments. A fleet could come apart from the inside before any storm or enemy contact had the opportunity to damage it from the outside. The history of Elizabethan expeditions was full of voyages that collapsed not through enemy action but through quarrels, desertions, and the slow erosion of command authority. Drake was determined that would not happen to him, and that determination would lead him to take actions later in the voyage that shocked even his supporters. What the departure from England revealed in miniature was everything that would define the voyage's hardest moments. The secrecy that protected the mission also created confusion and suspicion among the men carrying it out. The delays that weather imposed at the very start established an early pattern of disruption that never fully resolved. The social tensions built into the crew structure were already active, and the question of who ultimately held authority, Drake or the gentlemen who considered themselves his social superiors, was already being contested before the fleet had even reached the open Atlantic. These were not fatal cracks yet. The fleet was still together, still provisioned, still moving in the right direction. But the same forces that would later scatter the ships and drive one commander to abandon the mission entirely were already present. already at work, carried aboard those 5 vessels as surely as the cannon and the biscuit and the carefully guarded charts of the Strait of Magellan. Once clear of the English coast, the fleet moved south through the Atlantic, along a route that was well understood in broad outline, but never predictable in its particulars. The first significant stop came at the coast of Morocco, where Drake put in near the island of Mogador. This was already in operation with an eye towards self-sufficiency. The fleet needed to establish that it could acquire what it needed without being dependent on supply chains that might give away its position or intentions. Small Portuguese vessels were taken, their cargoes absorbed into the expedition's stores. A Portuguese pilot named Nuno da Silva was among those captured, and Drake made the decision to keep him. Da Silva had made the Atlantic crossing to Brazil before. He knew the currents, the winds, the hazards. Drake recognized immediately that this man's knowledge was worth more than anything else the captured ships were carrying, and da Silva would remain with the expedition for the better part of 2 years, an involuntary participant who nonetheless became indispensable. The sieges off Morocco accomplished something practical, but also something psychological. They demonstrated that the fleet could sustain itself through opportunistic action, that it was not a passive convoy at the mercy of whatever provisions had been loaded in Plymouth. Drake was showing his commanders and his crew that initiative had rewards, that the risks they were taking came with tangible returns. That lesson would matter later, when those returns would need to be far larger to keep the mission alive. From Morocco, the fleet pushed southwest, out into the open Atlantic, toward the Cape Verde Islands. The sailing here was not the nightmare of the high southern latitudes that would come later, but it was not comfortable either. The ships were heavily loaded. Provisioning a voyage of this ambition required packing every available space, and the conditions below decks reflected that cramped reality. Men lived in the dark, in the damp, in close proximity to everything and everyone around them. Disease did not need dramatic circumstances to take hold. It needed only time and confinement, and the Atlantic crossing provided both in abundance. Dysentery was an almost constant companion on voyages of this length. The water supplies, drawn from whatever sources were available and stored in wooden casks that were never truly clean, were a persistent source of illness. Food that had been carefully preserved when loaded began its inevitable degradation. Scurvy had not yet been understood, though its symptoms were being observed and its timeline was already familiar to men who had sailed long distances before. The body's slow rebellion against a diet stripped of what it needed was something sailors experienced first in their gums, then in their joints, then in a broader exhaustion that made every task harder. The crossing to South America was long enough to begin that process, without being quite long enough to complete its worst effects. That would come later. Morale followed a curve that any experienced mariner recognized. The early weeks of a long voyage carried a compressed version of anticipation, the sense that something extraordinary was beginning. Then that lifted, and what replaced it was the grinding monotony of ocean travel. Days that looked exactly like the days before them, watches that rotated through the same hours, sails that needed constant attention, rigging that chafed and wore and required repair, men whose irritability rose in direct proportion to the time they had spent in confined spaces with the same faces. The officers who managed this transition well were the ones who kept the crew occupied, who balanced discipline with moments of genuine relief, who understood that boredom was an enemy that worked from the inside. Drake was skilled at this, though his methods were not always gentle. He insisted on music aboard the flagship. Meals were conducted with a degree of ceremony that struck some of his contemporaries as excessive for a seaborne raiding expedition, but which served a clear function. The ritual of sitting down together, of shared meals with a degree of form and order, was Drake's way of maintaining the fiction that this was a civilized enterprise operating under civilized rules. It also kept gentlemen and sailors in the same room, eating the same food, which was a political statement as much as a logistical one. Drake had made it explicitly clear that he did not intend to allow the usual hierarchy of gentlemen above sailors to function the way it did on land. Everyone worked, everyone contributed. The man who could navigate and the man who could haul a line were both necessary, and Drake's table was his way of making that argument without always having to make it in words. But the tensions that had been present before the fleet left England did not dissolve in the Atlantic. They migrated. Doughty, specifically, was a persistent source of friction. By the time the fleet was somewhere off the coast of West Africa, there were already accusations moving between Drake and Doughty about interference with the crew, about poisoning the men against their commander, about the undermining of orders through whispered conversations and the subtle cultivation of grievance. Whether those accusations were entirely fair is almost impossible to determine at this distance. What is clear is that Drake believed them, and that belief was itself a destabilizing force. A commander who suspects his second-in-command of working against him is a commander whose attention is divided, whose decisions are shadowed by calculations that have nothing to do with wind and weather. The fleet as a formation remained intact, 5 ships, still sailing in rough coordination, still capable of acting as a unit. But a fleet is not simply the sum of its hulls. It is the sum of its intentions, its shared understanding of the mission, its collective willingness to submit to command. And in those terms, the fleet that was moving toward the South American coast was already showing the seams that pressure would eventually open. The form was intact, the function was already under negotiation. By the time the fleet raised the coast of Brazil, the crossing had taken months and had consumed not just provisions, but something harder to restock. The trust that a commander needs from the people around him, not the reluctant compliance of men who have no choice, but the active, willing trust of officers who believe in the mission and the man leading it, that had been spent down in ways that no amount of ceremony at table or captured Portuguese wine could fully replenish. The hard part was still ahead. The men carrying it knew that. What they were less certain about was whether they were all still heading toward the same thing. The fleet made its way down the South American coast through the southern autumn of 1578, and the further south it went, the more the temperature dropped and the mood darkened with it. When Drake brought the ships into the harbour at Port St. Julian, on the cold grey coast of what is now Argentina, the location carried a weight that no one aboard could have missed. It was the same harbour where Ferdinand Magellan had anchored 58 years earlier, where he had faced a mutiny among his own captains, and where he had dealt with it by executing one man and marooning another on that desolate shore. The bones of Magellan's justice were still there, literally. A gallows and a gibbet still stood on the headland. Drake had chosen this place deliberately, and everyone understood why. Thomas Doughty was a gentleman of some education and social standing, a man with connections at court and the kind of polish that came from moving in circles where influence was the primary currency. He had joined the expedition as something close to an equal partner in Drake's eyes, or at least that was how Doughty understood it. The two men had known each other before the voyage, and Doughty had apparently believed that the relationship conferred a degree of authority over the mission's direction that Drake never actually intended to share. This misunderstanding, if it was only a misunderstanding, had been accumulating weight since before the ships left Plymouth. The accusations against Doughty were serious, and had been building for months. Drake charged him with sowing discord among the crew, with attempting to undermine the commander's authority through private conversations and the deliberate cultivation of dissent. There were also more alarming charges, claims that Doughty had disclosed the expedition's secret intentions to Lord Burghley, Elizabeth's chief minister, and a man known to have reservations about provoking Spain. If that accusation was true, it meant Doughty had potentially exposed the entire mission to someone who might have preferred it to fail. Drake also accused him of practicing witchcraft, a charge that sounds bizarre now, but carried genuine weight in 1578, as a way of articulating something more felt than provable, the sense that Doughty was corrupting the expedition from within through means that resisted ordinary explanation. What followed was a trial, or something that called itself one. Drake convened a jury of 40 men from the combined ship companies and presided over the proceedings himself. Doughty was allowed to speak in his own defence, and by the accounts that survive, he did so with composure and even eloquence. He questioned the legitimacy of the entire proceeding. What authority, he asked, did Drake possess to conduct a capital trial in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from England, with no royal commission that clearly granted such power? It was a sharp legal argument, and it landed. Drake did not have a clean answer. He produced documents, made claims about the scope of his commission from the Queen, but the precise legal foundation for what he was doing was murky at best. He was improvising an institution in real time, on a cold beach at the bottom of the world, and everyone in that assembly knew it. The jury found Doughty guilty. Drake offered him a choice between 3 outcomes: execution, being marooned on the South American coast, or being returned to England to face judgment there. Doughty chose execution, which in its own way was a final assertion of the dignity he had been trying to maintain throughout. The 2 men reportedly shared a meal together afterward and received communion from the fleet's chaplain. Then Doughty knelt, and Drake's justice was carried out. His head was held up for the assembled crew with the declaration that this was what happened to those who conspired against the Queen's service. What the episode reveals is not simply that Drake was ruthless, though he was. It reveals the particular anxiety that sat at the centre of this entire enterprise, an expedition operating undercover, without the full public authorization that would have made its legal standing clear, had to generate its own internal order through whatever means its commander could devise. Drake could not appeal to a court back home. He could not wait for instructions. He was too far from any structure that might have validated his decisions, which meant the only authority available was the authority he could manufacture himself. The trial was theatre as much as justice, a performance designed to demonstrate that command existed, that it had teeth, that crossing it had consequences that no amount of social standing could deflect. The psychological effect was immediate and lasting. The men who watched Thomas Doughty die on that grey beach had just seen a gentleman with court connections, a man with real friends in high places, executed by a mariner's tribunal on a desolate coast. If that could happen to Doughty, the message required no translation. Drake's authority was not a matter of negotiation. It was not something that could be eroded through whispered grievance or gentlemanly condescension toward a man who had started life with less polish than his officers. From this point forward, the hierarchy of the expedition was Drake's hierarchy, structured precisely as he said it was, enforced with whatever he determined was necessary. Drake followed the execution with a speech to the assembled men that has come down through the historical record in several versions but carries a consistent core. He told them plainly what they were about to face. The Strait of Magellan lay ahead. Beyond it was the Pacific, largely unknown and entirely hostile to English interests. He needed men who would follow orders without qualification, who would work alongside each other regardless of class distinction, who would commit fully to what was coming. He told them that gentlemen must haul and draw with the mariner, and the mariner with the gentleman. He made it clear that anyone who could not accept those terms was free to take one of the smaller ships and return to England. Nobody went. The fleet that left Port St. Julian was smaller in number than the one that had arrived. One of the ships was broken up for timber and stores before the departure, a practical consolidation that also reflected the reality of diminished crew numbers after months at sea. But the fleet that moved south toward the strait was unified in a way that the earlier formation had never quite been. A line had been drawn at Port St. Julian in the most unambiguous terms possible. Whatever lay ahead, Drake had made certain that he would face it without a rival at his back. The fleet sailed south from Port St. Julian in late August of 1578, moving into waters where the world narrowed and the sky pressed down and the temperature dropped with every degree of latitude. The mood was different now from anything that had preceded it. The men were unified, yes, but they were also sailing into a part of the earth that almost no one alive had seen, and the few who had came back with stories that did not invite comfort. The Strait of Magellan is not a single passage, but a serpentine maze of channels, headlands, and hidden shallows that cuts through the bottom of South America for roughly 350 miles before opening into the Pacific. Magellan had taken 38 days to navigate it in 1520, and he had done so with the considerable advantage of not knowing what was on the other side, which meant he had nothing to dread until he got there. Drake's men knew what was on the other side. The Pacific was waiting, and so was everything the voyage had been secretly designed to do. Drake entered the strait on August 20th, and from the beginning the conditions made clear that this passage demanded respect that nautical skill alone could not fully supply. The channels ran in multiple directions, divided by rocky headlands and islands of bare grey stone, and the water moved through them with the force of two oceans pressing against each other in a space that gave neither of them adequate room. Currents shifted without warning, depth soundings offered limited reassurance, because the bottom could rise dramatically in a short distance, and the tidal patterns added their own rhythm to the chaos in ways that resisted easy prediction. The pilots worked constantly, reading whatever the water surface showed them, trying to project the shape of what lay ahead from the limited evidence of what lay immediately around. The cold was serious and unrelenting. This was the southern hemisphere's winter, and at those latitudes winter is not a metaphor. Ice glazed the rigging. The wind cut through clothing that had been adequate further north and was inadequate here. The crews worked through conditions that punished inattention and rewarded nothing but sustained physical effort. The landscape around them, though alien, was not without a certain brutal grandeur. Glaciers spilling down from mountains, waterfalls dropping directly into the sea, from cliffs that rose sheer from the water's edge, and the strange dense vegetation of the southernmost forests pressing down to the shoreline where it could find purchase. Keeping 5 ships together through that maze was a problem of coordination that should not be underestimated. In open ocean, a fleet could maintain visual contact relatively easily and adjust course with some leisure. In the strait, that margin collapsed. Ships had to follow each other through turns that were not always visible from one vessel's position to the next, had to maintain spacing that prevented collision without allowing the formation to stretch so thin that the rearmost vessels lost contact with the leaders. Drake had to manage this with signal flags and whatever communication the conditions permitted, which was frequently less than the situation demanded. The fragility of the fleet, as a collective enterprise, was never more apparent than in those narrow channels, where a single navigational error by one captain could separate that ship from the rest in a matter of minutes. Leaving it in a passage it would then have to navigate alone. The fleet made the passage in 16 days. This was remarkable. Magellan had needed more than twice as long, and the physical strait had not changed in the intervening 60 years. Drake pressed the fleet forward with a purposefulness that reflected both his urgency to reach the Pacific and his understanding that time spent in the strait was time spent in conditions that would wear his ships and his men down toward a threshold that could not be allowed to approach. 16 days through 350 miles of that terrain represents a pace that demanded constant effort and constant navigation, and it was sustained from beginning to end. When the leading ship finally cleared the western end of the strait and the Pacific opened ahead, it was a moment that carried the weight of genuine historical significance. Very few European vessels had reached this point by this route. Magellan had done it with survivors who were half dead before they crossed the ocean that lay ahead of them. Drake's fleet emerged into the Pacific intact, 5 ships with full crews supplied and capable. For English navigation, it was an arrival into an entirely new dimension of possibility. England had never had a presence in the Pacific, had never sent ships through the strait or around Cape Horn, had never challenged the monopoly that Spain and Portugal had constructed over access to this half of the world. The fleet floating at the western mouth of the Strait of Magellan in September of 1508 was the first serious English challenge to that arrangement. But the Pacific did not offer the reception that the name implied. The ocean named for its calm gave Drake's fleet something entirely different in its opening hours and days. The weather that had pressed against them in the strait did not release them when they cleared it. Instead, it gathered itself into something considerably worse. The sky to the west gave signals that experienced sailors read with unease, the particular quality of cloud and pressure and swell that precedes weather of serious intent. What was coming would not merely test the fleet, it would effectively end it as a formation. The storms that bore down on Drake's ships in the weeks following their entry into the Pacific were of a violence and duration that nothing in the previous months had prepared the men for, not the Atlantic crossing, not the southern coast of South America, not even the strait itself. The fleet that had held together through the crisis at Port St. Julian, that had navigated 16 days of the most demanding water on earth, that had arrived at the Pacific with its numbers and its unity still intact, was about to discover that unity is a fragile thing when the weather decides it is done tolerating you. Those storms would scatter the ships beyond any practical hope of reunion, and what emerged from them on the other side would not be a fleet at all. The storms hit with a comprehensiveness that left no room for gradual adjustment. Within days of clearing the strait, the fleet found itself in weather that redefined what the men understood that word to mean. The swells coming from the southwest were not the organized waves of an open ocean blow, but the chaotic, steep-sided mountains of water that form when multiple weather systems collide in a space where the Atlantic and Pacific meet, and where the continent ends, and there is nothing southward but open sea all the way to Antarctica. The wind did not blow in a direction so much as in all directions in rapid succession, shifting fast enough to leave sails pressed dangerously before crews could respond, then backing and pressing from the opposite quarter before the adjustment was complete. Drake's flagship, the Pelican, which he had renamed the Golden Hind somewhere during the Strait Passage as a gesture toward his patron Christopher Hatton, was driven south and east. This was the opposite of where the fleet needed to go. Every mile forced southward was a mile away from the Pacific coast of South America, away from the Spanish shipping lanes, away from the entire strategic purpose of the voyage. But the fleet had no capacity to choose its direction in weather like this. The choices available to sailors in those conditions were limited to surviving the present moment and hoping the future ones offered something less severe. Drake's helmsman fought to keep the ship from broaching, from being turned broadside to the swells in a configuration that could capsize her, and in doing so they accepted being pushed where the weather decided to push them. The Elizabeth, captained by John Winter, was the second of the fleet's larger vessels, and in the early violence of the storm it managed to maintain enough proximity to the Golden Hind that contact, however strained, remained possible. But the storms did not offer a single crisis, and then relent. They stacked one against the next, each with brief intervals that gave the ships time to assess their damage, but not to recover from it. In these intervals Drake could look around him and see the fleet in different states of distress, the ships spread further than was comfortable, the signals between them requiring increasingly urgent effort to maintain. The Marigold was the first to be confirmed gone. She was a smaller vessel, and in the kind of weather the fleet was now enduring, smaller meant less able to manage the combination of wind and wave that was determining everyone's fate. Exactly what happened to the Marigold is not recorded with precision, but the evidence points toward her going down in the storms. She simply ceased to be present in the moments when the weather briefly allowed Drake to take account of his fleet. No survivors from the Marigold reached the Golden Hind. The ship and everyone aboard her disappeared into the southern Pacific, in a way that left no document, no testimony, no aftermath beyond absence. The separation of the Elizabeth came differently. Winter managed to keep her afloat and intact, which was itself a significant achievement in those conditions, but the storms pushed the Golden Hind and the Elizabeth apart beyond the point where visual contact could be maintained, and at that latitude, in that weather, losing visual contact was very close to losing each other permanently. The problem was geometric and practical in equal measure. These were waters where no reliable chart existed, where there was no coastal landmark to navigate by, where the weather suppressed visibility to a small circle of churning grey water and airborne spray, and where the only way to find another ship was to agree in advance on where to look. Drake had contingency plans for separation, rendezvous points designated for exactly this kind of crisis, and Winter made his way to the agreed location. Drake was not there. Winter waited. Drake did not arrive. What Winter did not know, because he could not have known it, was that Drake had been driven dramatically further south and was not capable of reaching the rendezvous within any window that a waiting captain could practically observe. The storms had pushed the Golden Hind to latitudes below the strait's southern entrance, into waters where the continent effectively ended and open ocean continued toward the polar south. There is some evidence that Drake glimpsed or reached a point south of what was then known as the continent's terminus, which would later inform the geographic understanding that the tip of South America was not a land mass connecting to a southern continent, but a cape with open water below it. But in the immediate term, none of this geographic discovery was useful. Drake was alone, far south of where he needed to be, battered, with a crew that had been pushed hard for months, and was now being pushed beyond what any of them had anticipated signing on for. Winter eventually made a decision that was practically understandable, even if it would define his historical legacy in unflattering terms. After waiting at the rendezvous without any sign of Drake or any other surviving vessel, he turned the Elizabeth back toward the strait. He navigated it eastward, returned to the Atlantic, and eventually made his way back to England. He arrived home before Drake, which meant he arrived with the only first-hand account of what had happened, and his account had to explain a decision to abandon the Pacific mission rather than continue it. The explanations he offered were disputed, and the criticism he received was real, but his ship and his crew survived, which was more than could be said for everything the fleet had carried into the Pacific. The two remaining smaller vessels, the Christopher and the Swan, had already been dealt with by the time the fleet reached the Pacific. The Christopher had been taken by the Spanish in earlier episodes, and the Swan had been broken up for timber and supplies during the voyage south, their crews redistributed to the remaining ships. So the Pacific storms did not scatter 5 ships but 3, and of those 3, one went to the bottom and one turned around, leaving a single hull and a single crew to represent everything the English crown had invested and everything Drake had planned. The 5-ship fleet was finished, not by Spanish cannons, not by the navigational challenge of the strait, not by the crisis at Port St. Julian that had threatened to unravel the voyage before it properly began. The fleet died in weather that had no interest in English ambitions or royal charters, or the careful logistics of a secretly planned operation against the Spanish Empire. What remained was the Golden Hind alone in a Pacific that was vast and indifferent, and entirely uncharted by anyone England had ever sent to look at it. So the fleet that left Plymouth with such careful preparation and such elaborate secrecy was now reduced to 1 ship. But the way that reduction happened is worth examining with more precision, because the 4 missing vessels did not all meet the same end, and collapsing their fates into a single story of loss obscures what actually occurred, and what the historical record can and cannot tell us. Start with the Swan and the Christopher, because their fates were decided before the Pacific ever came into play. The Swan was a small bark that Drake had brought for utility rather than firepower, and during the long southern passage down the Atlantic coast of South America, she was deliberately stripped and broken up. This was not a loss in the conventional sense. Drake ordered it. The Swan's timber and iron and cordage were cannibalized into the remaining ships, and her crew was distributed among the hulls that were still sailing. She did not sink, was not captured, was not separated by weather. She was consumed by the expedition itself as a planned act of logistics. Drake was managing the long-term survivability of his fleet, reducing the number of vessels he needed to crew and supply. The Swan's end was intentional and controlled, which makes her distinct from everything that followed. The Christopher's case is messier, and the records are less clean. She was a smaller vessel that had already changed hands once during the voyage, having been seized by Spanish authorities during an earlier coastal encounter, and then recovered by Drake in an action that itself speaks to the volatile and improvised nature of the expedition's early months. At some point during the reorganization of the fleet before the Strait transit, the Christopher appears to have been similarly broken up or otherwise disposed of, her useful materials absorbed into the surviving ships. The documentary trail around the Christopher is thinner than historians would prefer, and there is some disagreement about exactly when she was removed from the fleet's active complement. What is clear is that she was not among the 3 ships that entered the Strait of Magellan as a functioning vessel. Whether her final disposition came through deliberate scuttling, stripping for parts, or some combination of actions that the surviving accounts treat too briefly to reconstruct fully, she was gone from the fleet's operational roster before the Pacific storms became anyone's problem. That leaves 3 ships entering the open Pacific: the Golden Hind, the Elizabeth, and the Marigold. The Marigold's fate is the one that historians can state with the most confidence and the least detail simultaneously. She went down. Exactly how and exactly when during the storm sequence is not recorded with enough precision to reconstruct the final hours. The accounts that survive were written by men who were aboard the Golden Hind or the Elizabeth, not the Marigold, and they could only report what they observed from a distance in conditions that severely limited observation. What they recorded was her absence. She was present in the storm, and then she was not present, and no one from the Marigold's crew reached the other ships to describe what had happened. The assumption of sinking is the only conclusion the evidence supports, but the specific cause, whether she was overwhelmed by water, capsized, driven onto a submerged rock in those chaotic, uncharted waters, or simply battered past the point of staying afloat, belongs to the category of things that cannot be recovered from the record. The Elizabeth story is the one that generated the most controversy and the most subsequent argument, partly because Winter survived to tell his version of it, and partly because his version required justification. He brought the ship through the storms intact, which was a genuine feat of seamanship. He reached the designated rendezvous point that the fleet had established for exactly this kind of separation. He waited. Drake did not appear. The question that historians and contemporaries alike have turned over repeatedly is how long Winter waited and why he ultimately decided to turn back, rather than proceed independently along the Pacific coast toward the Spanish shipping lanes that the Voyage had been organized to raid. Winter's own account emphasized the condition of his crew, the damage to the ship, and the reasonable conclusion that Drake was lost given how long the rendezvous had passed without contact. His crew reportedly pushed hard for the return, and there is some evidence that Winter faced pressure bordering on the collective rather than simply making a unilateral captain's decision. Whether his decision was cowardice, prudence, or a misreading of a situation that looked much more dire from inside it than it appears in retrospect. The Elizabeth turned eastward, re-navigated the strait, crossed the Atlantic and arrived in England in June of 1579. Winter reached home months before Drake, carrying the only fresh eyewitness account of the storm's destruction and the fleet's collapse. His account shaped initial English understanding of what had happened, and it did so in a context where he had significant personal interest in how his return was characterized. The records he produced are therefore useful but not entirely neutral, which is a complication that historians who work on this period have to navigate carefully. What remains genuinely uncertain is whether Drake and Winter made any contact whatsoever during the storm period before the final separation, or whether they lost each other cleanly and early in the chaos. The accounts are inconsistent on this point in ways that matter for understanding Winter's decision. If Winter had any indication that Drake was still operational somewhere to the south, his decision to abandon the rendezvous looks different than if every piece of evidence available to him at the time genuinely pointed toward the Golden Hind being lost. The reconstructed picture, then, is this. 2 ships deliberately removed from the fleet before the Pacific Challenge even arrived. 1 ship sunk with all hands in the post-Strait storms. 1 ship surviving those storms and choosing to return rather than continue alone. Each of those endings is distinct. Each reflects a different kind of decision or disaster. And across all of them, the record's gaps mean that some of what appears in confident summary form in popular accounts is actually inference built on incomplete testimony from men who survived to have an interest in how the story was told. So Drake emerged from that chaos with a single ship, a reduced crew, and a mission that no longer resembled the one that had left Plymouth. The fleet structure was gone. The mutual support between vessels was gone. The insurance of having multiple hulls to spread damage and share supplies was gone. What remained was the Golden Hind, somewhere in the waters south of the Spanish Pacific coast, and a captain who had to decide very quickly what kind of voyage this was going to be now. The renaming of the ship matters here, and it is easy to dismiss it as ceremony at a moment when ceremony seemed like a luxury. But Drake had renamed the vessel during the earlier stages of the voyage, changing her from the Pelican to the Golden Hind, and the choice was not arbitrary. The Golden Hind was a reference to the heraldic crest of Sir Christopher Hatton, one of the voyage's key backers at court, and a man whose continued support Drake needed to protect. Renaming the ship was a political act, a way of cementing a relationship that would matter enormously when Drake returned to England and had to account for everything that had happened. It was also a signal of intent. The vessel now carried its patron symbol into the Pacific, which framed whatever came next as a deliberate enterprise rather than the ragged survival it might otherwise have appeared to be. Drake understood that how a voyage was narrated back home would shape its meaning, and he was managing that narrative even while he was still sailing. The practical situation, though, demanded attention well before any future reputation could be considered. The Golden Hind had taken punishment in the storms, and the reduced crew meant that every repair, every watch, every task involved men who were already exhausted, covering roles that had previously been distributed more broadly. Somewhere in the channels south of the storm zone, Drake put in to assess and address the damage. The ship needed attention to her hull, her rigging, her stores. The crew needed rest and, critically, a renewed sense of purpose. They had watched ships disappear around them. They had survived something that killed their companions. The psychological weight of that was real, and Drake was experienced enough to understand that a dispirited crew on a damaged ship in unknown waters was a problem that could compound rapidly if it was not addressed. What Drake did in this period reflects the quality that defined his command more than any single act of boldness. He adapted. The original mission had been structured around a fleet capable of sustained operations along the South American coast, with multiple ships providing mutual protection and the ability to spread risk. That structure was gone, and trying to replicate it with one ship would have been both impossible and dangerous. Drake reconfigured the mission entirely. Instead of a fleet action, the Golden Hind would function as a fast-moving raider, relying on speed, surprise, and the complete lack of Spanish preparedness for any English vessel in Pacific waters. The Spanish had never considered the possibility that a foreign ship could reach their Pacific coast, which meant their ports were unfortified against naval threat, their shipping moved without convoy, and their colonial administration had no protocols for responding to exactly what Drake was about to do. That Spanish vulnerability was the strategic opportunity that the reduced expedition could actually exploit. A larger fleet would have been harder to conceal, harder to supply, and more likely to provoke an organized response. One fast ship handled aggressively could move up the coast faster than news of its presence could travel ahead of it. Drake's flexibility converted a catastrophe into an asymmetric advantage, though recognizing that advantage required a particular cast of mind, the willingness to discard the original plan and find the opportunity inside the disaster. Supply was the chronic problem that this strategic reconfiguration could not entirely solve. The Golden Hind needed provisions for a crew operating far from any English supply line, in waters controlled by a hostile empire, with no allies and no resupply network. Drake addressed this through the raids themselves, taking food, water and equipment from the Spanish ships and ports he captured. This meant the mission was in some sense self-financing and self-supplying as it progressed. but it also meant that operational survival depended on continued success. A run of failed raids, or a serious defensive response from the Spanish, would have left the ship in an increasingly desperate position. The margin for error was narrow, and Drake could not afford the kind of sustained period without prizes that a better provisioned expedition might have weathered. Crew cohesion was the less visible challenge running beneath all of this. The men aboard the Golden Hind had endured the trial at Port St. Julian, the brutal transit of the strait, and the catastrophic storms. They had seen the Marigold vanish and watched the Elizabeth turn back. They knew they were alone in an ocean that no English ship had ever crossed before, in waters that their empire actively claimed and would defend if it could organize a response. Keeping men committed under those conditions required more than orders. It required Drake to project confidence convincingly enough that the crew's collective assessment of their own survival odds stayed above the threshold of despair. Contemporary accounts suggest he managed this through a combination of energy, personal involvement in the ship's operations, and the kind of selective optimism that good commanders deploy in exactly these circumstances. He framed the situation as opportunity rather than crisis. He kept the crew busy and, soon enough, successful. The raids that followed were the proof of concept for everything Drake had reconfigured. They demonstrated that the single-ship approach worked, that the Spanish vulnerability was real, and that the mission could be prosecuted by one hull operating at speed against targets that had no idea it was coming. But none of that success would have been possible without the period of rebuilding and recalibration that happened first. In the quiet waters south of the Spanish colonial world, where Drake looked at what remained and decided it was enough. The Golden Hind had been built as one vessel among 5. She emerged from the southern ordeal as the only vessel there was. What Drake made of that situation in the months that followed would determine whether the entire enterprise was remembered as a catastrophe or as something else entirely. The Spanish Pacific was, in the minds of the men who administered it, a closed sea. No foreign power had demonstrated the ability to reach it. No foreign ship had ever appeared on its waters. The ports along the South American coast existed without walls on their seaward side, because walls in that direction had never been considered necessary. The Empire had built its Pacific infrastructure around the assumption that the ocean itself was the defence, and for nearly 60 years that assumption had been entirely correct. When the Golden Hind moved north along the Chilean coast in early 1579, she was sailing into a security architecture that had a fundamental gap built into it, and Drake was about to move through that gap at speed. The first raids were almost insultingly easy. At Valparaiso, Drake entered the harbour and approached a Spanish vessel called the Grand Captain of the South, while her crew celebrated, apparently assuming any ship in these waters was friendly. By the time the situation became clear to them, it was already over. Drake's men took the ship without meaningful resistance, unloaded her cargo of Chilean wine, gold and provisions, stripped her of anything useful, and departed before the port had organised any response at all. The town itself was raided. Stores were taken. The Golden Hind's depleted provisions were replenished by the Empire that was supposed to be impenetrable in these waters. What this first success established was the operational pattern Drake would repeat up the entire length of the coast. He moved faster than information. In a world without telegraph or radio, news of a raid travelled only as fast as a messenger on horseback or a ship under sail, and Drake consistently outpaced both. By the time word of his presence at one location reached the next port north, he had already raided that port and moved on. The Spanish colonial administration was not slow or incompetent. It was simply operating under a system designed for a world in which this threat did not exist, and it had no mechanism for rapidly reorganizing around a danger it had never anticipated. The raids accumulated. At Tarapaca, Drake's men found a Spanish official asleep on the beach beside a consignment of silver bars. They took the silver. The official presumably woke up. At Arica, there were bars of silver and chests waiting at the dock, evidently staged for loading onto a northbound vessel. Drake took those too. The pattern here was not just one of violence and seizure, but of extraordinary intelligence gathering. Drake interrogated captured sailors and officials, extracted information about shipping schedules, cargo manifests, and the movements of the most valuable vessels on the coast, and used that intelligence to refine his targeting as he moved north. He was not simply raiding opportunistically. He was building a picture of the Spanish Pacific supply system and identifying its most valuable nodes. The intelligence had a compounding effect on the strategic damage Drake was doing. Each raid disrupted not only the immediate cargo taken, but the confidence of the entire system. Spanish merchants and port officials along the Pacific coast had operated for generations without considering security as a serious category of concern. Drake forced it onto their agenda in a single sweep up the coastline. The administrative cost of the response, the messengers dispatched, the emergency councils convened, the watches posted at ports that had never needed them before, represented a disruption that extended far beyond the direct economic value of what was seized. And the direct economic value was already substantial. The gold and silver accumulating in the Golden Hind's hold represented treasure extracted from a supply chain that fed Spanish imperial finance across 2 hemispheres. Every bar of silver Drake took was a bar that did not reach Callao or Panama, did not cross the Atlantic, and did not fund the machinery of Habsburg power in Europe. Drake was a single ship crewed by fewer than 100 men, and the economic damage he was inflicting was disproportionate in ways that the Spanish would need time to fully account for. The contrast between the shrinking scale of the expedition and its growing strategic impact was, by this point in the voyage, almost absurd. Drake had left Plymouth with 5 ships and arrived in the Pacific with 1. He had lost vessels to storms, to desertion, to the attrition of months at sea. He was operating without backup, without the ability to absorb serious damage, without any port in the known world where he could make legitimate repairs or resupply. And yet the single ship was accomplishing more along the Spanish Pacific coast than the full fleet could have achieved through any conventional operation. A larger English force would have been detected earlier, would have provoked a faster organised response, and would have lacked the speed that made Drake's approach so devastatingly effective. The reduction of the fleet had, perversely, made the mission more dangerous for Spain, not less. Drake also understood something about psychological warfare that many of his contemporaries grasped only partially. The shock he was generating had a value independent of the treasure he was seizing. Spanish officials writing to Madrid described the English captain in terms that suggest genuine alarm, not simply bureaucratic complaint. Here was a heretic, an English pirate, freely operating in waters the Crown considered its sovereign territory, taking ships and cargoes and supplies without encountering any resistance capable of stopping him. The political humiliation embedded in those dispatches was real. Philip II would eventually read them, and the rage they produced contributed directly to the strategic calculations that led Spain toward its later confrontation with England. Drake was not just raiding a coastline, he was eroding the credibility of Spanish imperial omnipotence in a domain Spain had considered untouchable. By the time the Golden Hind approached the waters off Ecuador and Peru, she was carrying significant weight in captured goods. Her crew had developed a practiced efficiency at boarding and securing prizes, and Drake had refined his intelligence about what lay ahead. The information collected from captured sailors pointed toward a specific vessel, a treasure ship of extraordinary value that was somewhere on the Pacific between Callao and Panama. Its name, rendered in the accounts of the voyage with varying degrees of accuracy, was the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. Her crew had a less reverent nickname for her. They called her the Cacafuego. Drake was about to find her. The chase began with a deliberate piece of misdirection. Drake had learned from captured sailors that the Cacafuego was ahead of him somewhere on the route north toward Panama, and he understood that news of his presence on the coast, however slowly it travelled, might already be moving ahead of him. To keep the Cacafuego's captain from altering course or running for a friendly harbour, Drake reportedly ordered the Golden Hind to drag lines astern, slowing her apparent speed and masking the urgency of the pursuit. He was covering distance while looking, to any observer, like a vessel in no particular hurry. He also used a simpler piece of incentive to sharpen his crew's attention. Drake announced that whoever first spotted the Cacafuego would receive a gold chain as reward. On a long ocean pursuit, that kind of concrete prize focused eyes on the horizon in a way that general orders could not. It worked. On the 1st of March 1579, off the coast near the modern border of Ecuador and Peru, one of his men spotted the ship. The Cacafuego was exactly where the intelligence said she would be, running the standard route northward, heavily loaded, entirely unaware that anything in these waters could threaten her. The approach was managed carefully. Drake closed the distance in a way that would not trigger alarm too early, reportedly using a technique of dragging wine jugs astern to slow his visible speed and avoid the telltale sign of a ship bearing down under full sail. When the gap was narrow enough, the Golden Hind revealed herself for what she was. The Cacafuego's captain, San Juan de Anton, had no reason to expect a hostile vessel in these waters, and apparently believed, even at close range, that the approaching ship might be a Spanish vessel demanding routine assistance or communication. By the time the situation was unmistakable, it was too late to run. Drake's gunners fired a volley. Drake's men boarded, and the Cacafuego was taken with very little resistance and no real capacity for defence. A treasure ship was not a warship. She was not built to fight. She was built to carry, and she had been carrying with remarkable efficiency. What the Golden Hind's men found in her hold took time to fully inventory. The accounts from the voyage describe the process of transfer lasting several days, which itself indicates the sheer volume of what was being moved. The Cacafuego was carrying silver in bars and in coins, an enormous quantity of it, the accumulated product of the Andean silver mines moving through the Pacific supply chain toward Panama and eventually the Atlantic crossing to Spain. Alongside the silver were quantities of gold, uncut emeralds and other precious stones, and general cargo of considerable value. The figures recorded by participants and later chroniclers vary, but the most credible estimates suggest something in the range of 26 tons of silver, 80 pounds of gold and jewels and other goods on top of that. The Golden Hind had arrived in the Pacific with a depleted crew and a single vessel. She was now carrying what amounted to a significant fraction of a year's output from the most productive silver extraction operation in the world. The seizure of the Cacafuego transformed the character of the entire voyage in a single afternoon. Everything that had come before, the successful raids at Valparaiso and Arica and Tarapacá, the accumulated gold and silver from a dozen smaller prizes, represented impressive plunder from a strategic and financial standpoint. But the Cacafuego was different in kind. The treasure loaded into the Golden Hind over those days of transfer was not incrementally more valuable than what had come before. It was categorically more valuable, an amount that would have represented a major windfall for Elizabeth's treasury, a meaningful addition to English royal finances, and a return on the investment of the voyage that exceeded almost any prior calculation of what the expedition might realistically achieve. It also changed Drake's position in a fundamental way, and not entirely to his advantage. Before the Cacafuego, the Golden Hind was a fast, relatively light raider moving through waters where speed and surprise were her primary assets. After loading 26 tons of silver into a vessel already carrying the accumulated plunder of months of raiding, the Golden Hind was considerably heavier. She still handled well. Drake's crew knew her intimately by this point, but the margin for error had shifted. The treasure that was the expedition's greatest success was also a constraint on its future freedom of movement. The dangers facing the return journey multiplied accordingly. The Spanish colonial administration, already alarmed and humiliated by months of raids along the coast, was now aware that the English ship had taken the most valuable treasure haul the Pacific had ever seen to a foreign enemy. Ships were dispatched to find Drake and recover the silver. Reports were sent to Panama and to Spain. The fury in those communications was not bureaucratic routine, but something closer to genuine emergency. Drake knew that retracing his route south, back through the Strait of Magellan, would mean sailing into whatever response Spain had managed to organise, and with a hold full of silver weighing down his ship, a running fight with Spanish naval vessels was a prospect of a different order than anything he had faced before. The Cacafuego, in this way, made the return journey impossible through the route he had come. The treasure that justified the entire expedition also foreclosed the most obvious path home. Drake would have to find another way back to England, and the weight of silver below decks meant that every decision about route, about risk, about how far north to push before turning west across the Pacific, was being made against a backdrop of immense and fragile value that could not be surrendered or abandoned and could not be fully defended if Spain found him in force. One ship had captured another ship, but what the Cacafuego actually represented was something larger than either vessel. She was the concentrated product of an empire's extraction system, the physical embodiment of Spanish Pacific commerce, and by taking her Drake had done something no single English vessel had ever done before. He had struck at the financial nervous system of the Habsburg Empire in a place the empire had believed beyond reach. Everything that followed from the voyage, the diplomatic consequences, the strategic realignment, the legend that formed around Drake's name, had its origin in those several days of transfer off the Ecuadorian coast, when the treasure of an empire moved from one hold to another. With the Cacafuego's treasure secured and the southern route home effectively closed, Drake faced a navigational problem that was as much political as geographic. He needed to get back to England without crossing paths with whatever Spanish response was already forming. The most elegant theoretical solution was one that English navigators and cartographers had been discussing for years: a passage somewhere along the northern coast of the Americas, connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic, the so-called Northwest Passage, or its Pacific counterpart, the Strait of Magellan. If such a route existed, Drake could sail north, find it, and emerge into familiar waters without ever having to thread back through Spanish-controlled approaches. The idea was credible enough to justify the attempt, and the alternative routes carried obvious dangers that the weight of silver in his hold made even less acceptable than they would otherwise have been. So Drake turned the Golden Hind north and pushed up the American coastline in the spring of 1579. How far north he actually went is one of the most persistently contested questions attached to the entire voyage, and it has remained contested for 4.5 centuries despite, or perhaps because of, the volume of scholarship devoted to it. The accounts that survive from the voyage report that Drake reached latitudes somewhere in the range of 48 degrees north, a figure that would place him well above San Francisco and into the waters off what is now the Oregon or possibly Washington coast. Some versions of the narrative claim he pushed even higher, to around 50 or 52 degrees, which would put him off the coast of British Columbia or southern Alaska. Neither figure can be verified with certainty, and neither can be confidently dismissed. The problem is not simply that the documents are incomplete, though they are. It is that the surviving records were themselves shaped by purposes that had nothing to do with geographic precision. The accounts were edited, translated, and in some cases deliberately obscured to protect the intelligence value of whatever Drake had observed. England had no interest in publishing a reliable navigational chart of the Pacific coast of North America in 1580. The specific latitude records were useful secrets, and useful secrets do not survive intact through 4 centuries of copying, translation, and political calculation. What is generally accepted is that Drake reached latitudes cold and uncomfortable enough to convince him that the Northwest Passage, if it existed, was not going to be accessible that season, and possibly not at all in any practical sense. The accounts describe biting cold, persistent fog, and winds that made northward progress increasingly punishing. The crew, who had been living aboard a single ship through months of oceanic conditions, were not in a state suited to extended exploration of Arctic approaches. Drake turned south. The subsequent landfall, wherever precisely it occurred, is what has passed into the record as Nova Albion. At some point in the summer of 1579, the Golden Hind anchored in a harbour on the California coast. The crew came ashore, and Drake made a claim of possession in the name of the English crown. The name he gave the territory translated simply as New England, a deliberate echo of the homeland, and a deliberate assertion that this coast belonged, in some meaningful sense, to Elizabeth rather than to Spain. A brass plate was reportedly left behind recording the claim, and contact was made with the local indigenous population, described in the surviving accounts as friendly and, in the more embellished versions of the narrative, as enthusiastically endorsing English sovereignty over their land. The specific location of this anchorage has generated more scholarly debate than almost any other question connected to the voyage. Drake's Bay, north of San Francisco, has been the most frequently proposed site, and for decades a brass plate discovered there in the 1930s was treated as physical confirmation. That plate was eventually determined to be a modern forgery, which cleared the field for continued disagreement. San Francisco Bay itself has been proposed. So have points significantly further north. The climate descriptions in the accounts, references to fog, cold, and the uncomfortable dampness of the anchorage, even in summer, have been used to argue both for and against various specific locations, with the California coast offering enough variation in microclimate that the meteorological evidence cuts in different directions depending on what aspects of it you choose to weight. What the Nova Albion episode represents, beyond its role in the continuing location debate, is a moment when Drake's voyage crossed from commercial raiding into the territory of imperial claim-making. Taking treasure from Spanish ships was profitable and strategically meaningful, but it did not expand the map of English sovereignty. Landing on a coast, naming it, and asserting possession on behalf of the Crown was a different category of action. Whether Elizabeth ever intended to act on the claim, whether it influenced subsequent English interest in Pacific exploration and colonization, and whether the indigenous people present had any conception of what the ceremony being performed around them was supposed to mean, are all questions the surviving sources handle with varying degrees of inadequacy. The Northern Push and the Nova Albion landing sit in a part of the narrative where the expedition's own documentation becomes thinnest, and the retrospective interpretation most heavily loaded. Drake had every incentive on his return to describe himself as having gone further and discovered more than the record might strictly support. The English crown had every incentive to encourage a narrative that maximised the territorial implications of the voyage. The Spanish had every incentive to argue that Drake had seen nothing of consequence and claimed nothing of legal validity. None of these parties were disinterested archivists. This section of the voyage, in other words, is not simply one episode among many. It is the episode that most visibly illustrates the fundamental condition of everything we know about the circumnavigation. The dramatic moments, the storms, the capture of the Cacafuego, the execution at Port St. Julian. These survive in the record because they were vivid, because they were useful as legend, and because their essential outlines were never in anyone's serious interest to deny. The question of how far north Drake sailed, and where exactly he came ashore on the California coast, survives without resolution, because the people who knew the truth had reasons not to record it cleanly, and what they did record has been argued over ever since. He came north. He came ashore. He left a name on a stretch of coastline. Beyond that, the certainty runs out quickly, and that absence of certainty is itself one of the most revealing things about the voyage. At some point in the late summer of 1579, Drake made the decision that transformed the Golden Hind's journey from an extraordinarily successful raiding expedition into something else entirely. The Northern Passage had not materialized. The California coast had given him a place to rest, refit, and make a ceremonial claim in the Queen's name. What lay ahead, however, was not a known route home, but the largest single stretch of open ocean on the planet. Drake turned west into the Pacific. The crossing from the Americas to island Southeast Asia was not simply a long sail. It was a commitment of a different order than anything the expedition had previously attempted. The Atlantic crossing that had opened the voyage however fraught with suspicion and early difficulty, was a passage European sailors had been making for nearly a century by that point. The Pacific was different in scale and in kind. From the California coast westward to the first islands of the East Indies, the distance runs to something in the neighbourhood of 7,000 miles, with nothing of consequence in between. No resupply, no shelter from weather, no possibility of assistance if the ship suffered serious damage. The Golden Hind would either reach the far side, or it would not. The navigation Drake employed drew on whatever combination of captured charts, pilot knowledge and dead reckoning his expedition had assembled over the course of the voyage. The Pacific was not entirely unmapped from the English perspective. Spanish knowledge of its major features, its prevailing winds and currents, the approximate positions of the island chains that lay scattered across it, had been leaking into European cartographic consciousness for decades, and Drake's preparations in London had presumably included whatever intelligence England had managed to acquire, still committing a single vessel, heavily laden with treasure and crewed by men who had been at sea for the better part of 2 years. To a crossing of this magnitude was a different thing from having a chart that suggested it was possible. The pressure of food and water on this leg of the voyage was significant, in a way that earlier sections of the journey had not quite matched. Provisioning for an open ocean Pacific crossing meant carrying everything the crew would need for weeks of sailing, with no opportunity for resupply. The diet that sustained the crew across the Pacific was almost certainly reduced and monotonous well before land appeared on the horizon. By this stage of the circumnavigation, the men aboard the Golden Hind were experienced at functioning under physical strain, but experience does not make hunger or the anxiety of a dwindling water supply easier to bear. The crossing would have tested both the ship's stores and the crew's endurance in ways that left little margin for navigational error. The first meaningful landfall came in the island world of the Western Pacific, and as Drake moved through the islands of what is now the Philippines and eastern Indonesia, the character of the voyage shifted again. These were not empty waters. The trade networks of island Southeast Asia had connected China, India, and the Arabian Peninsula for centuries, before any European ship appeared in the region. The Portuguese had forced their way into this world after 1511, establishing footholds at Malacca and pressing toward the spice-producing islands of the Moluccas, which lay further east. By 1579, the Portuguese presence was real but not omnipresent, and the local rulers who controlled access to the islands and their trade had their own political calculations about which foreign relationships were worth cultivating. Drake was navigating this environment as a newcomer without the established relationships or the established reputation, good or bad, that the Portuguese had built over decades. What he brought instead was the Golden Hind itself, its cargo of silver, and the evident willingness to engage in trade on terms that local rulers could find acceptable. The encounters he had in the islands, exchanges of goods, formal diplomatic meetings with local leaders, careful negotiation of his position in a world that had its own power structures and its own well-developed sense of what foreigners were worth dealing with, mark a passage that looks nothing like the privateering that defined his time along the Spanish-American coast. The Moluccas, when Drake reached them, represented the end point of a commercial logic that ran back to the origins of oceanic exploration itself. These islands, specifically the cluster known as the Spice Islands, were the source of cloves and nutmeg in quantities found nowhere else on Earth. The spice trade was not a marginal commercial interest in the 16th century. It was one of the central engines of European economic ambition, the reason Portugal had driven south and east around Africa, the reason Spain had backed Columbus's westward gamble, the reason Magellan had been funded for the voyage that Drake was now completing in reverse. Reaching the Moluccas meant reaching the source of a commodity that European consumers paid extraordinary prices for, and that the Portuguese had been attempting to monopolize through their Estado da India network of fortified trading posts and licensed shipping. Drake's arrival there was not, in the context of English strategic thinking, an accident. England had been watching the spice trade's profits flow to Portugal and Spain for decades. The commercial logic of breaking into that trade, of establishing English access to the source rather than buying at Portuguese terms, was something that merchant interests in London had been advocating for years. Drake reaching the Moluccas and negotiating even a preliminary trade relationship with the Sultan of Ternate, one of the most significant rulers in the clove-producing islands, was a demonstration that the route was physically possible and that English ships could operate in these waters. By the time the Golden Hind was loading spices in the Moluccas, the voyage had travelled so far from its origins that the word privateer barely applies. A fleet that had left Plymouth under cover of a false story about trading in the Mediterranean had crossed the Atlantic, transited the Strait of Magellan, raided the Pacific coast of Spanish America, pushed north along a coastline no Englishman had seen before, and then crossed the world's largest ocean to reach the very islands that had set the entire age of European expansion in motion. Drake had not planned every stage of this when he left England. The route had been shaped by storms, by the collapse of the fleet, by the strategic situation he found along the Pacific coast, and by decisions made under pressure at sea. But the result was a voyage that now connected the raid on Cacafuego's silver to the global architecture of the spice trade. Whatever came next, the Golden Hind had already crossed into a different category of achievement entirely. The spices were loaded. The diplomatic courtesies with the Sultan of Ternate had been observed, and the Golden Hind turned south and west toward home. Drake had been at sea for more than 2 years. His crew was depleted, his ship was carrying an extraordinary weight of silver and gold from the Pacific raids, alongside the newly acquired spices, and the waters between the Moluccas and the Cape of Good Hope were some of the most poorly charted on earth. The route home was, in theory, known. The Portuguese had been sailing it for decades. But knowing a route exists, and navigating it successfully through unfamiliar reefs and currents in a vessel you cannot afford to lose, are very different problems. The near catastrophe came in January of 1580, somewhere in the island waters south of the Moluccas, as the Golden Hind worked her way through the archipelago, toward open ocean. The ship ran hard aground on a reef. By any ordinary calculation of maritime disaster, this should have ended the voyage. A heavily laden vessel pinned on a reef in the dark, taking on water in waters her crew did not know well, with no other ship to take on survivors, and no nearby settlement of any kind that would have been likely to help an English crew in Portuguese-influenced waters. The combination of factors was as dangerous as anything the expedition had encountered since the storms that scattered and destroyed the fleet coming through the Strait of Magellan. What followed was a sustained and desperate effort to save the ship. Everything that could be moved was considered for sacrifice. Drake reportedly led the effort personally, and the accounts of the grounding describe the crew working through hours of strain to lighten the vessel enough to float her free. Some cargo went over the side. How much is difficult to establish with precision, but the principle was simple and brutal. Treasure taken at enormous risk and carried across 2 oceans was less valuable than the ship itself, because without the ship none of it would reach England. Cannon, supplies, and some portion of the spice cargo were among the things the crew were prepared to jettison. The religious dimension of the crisis appears in some accounts as well, Drake conducting prayers as the crew worked, treating the grounding as a moment of collective reckoning that required both practical labour and something more. The ship came free. The hull was not so badly damaged as to be unsalvageable. But the episode revealed with the kind of clarity that only near disaster produces how precarious the final leg of the circumnavigation actually was. The Golden Hind had survived the Pacific crossing, the raids along the Spanish coast, and the storms below Tierra del Fuego. Losing her on a reef in the East Indies, within measurable distance of open ocean and the long run home, would have been an ending that history would have recorded very differently. The passage through the remaining island waters demanded exactly the kind of careful navigation that the Reef had demonstrated the crew needed to apply more rigorously. Shallow waters, uncharted shoals, and the general unfamiliarity of the geography made every mile a calculation. The Golden Hind was not built for exploration in the sense that she carried sophisticated survey equipment, or operated with the caution of a vessel whose primary purpose was charting. She was a fighting ship adapted for a raiding voyage, and she was carrying more weight than she was designed to carry comfortably. A heavily laden hull rides lower in the water and handles differently in difficult conditions. The margin between a safe passage and another grounding was thinner than the crew would have preferred. Rationing had been a feature of the voyage for a long time by this point, but the demands of the Indian Ocean crossing sharpened the pressure. The route from the East Indies around the Cape of Good Hope is not a short passage. It runs through the southern Indian Ocean, across waters that can produce serious weather, and around a cape that had earned its reputation for violence among the sailors who had encountered it in bad condition. Provisioning for this stretch meant calculating carefully what the crew would need against what the ship could carry, while also keeping the silver and the spices that represented the financial justification for the entire enterprise. The men sailing the Golden Hind in early 1580 were functioning on reduced rations, tired in the way that extended voyaging produces, and aware that the ship they were on had just demonstrated its vulnerability, in a way that made every subsequent mile feel slightly different than the miles before the reef. The Indian Ocean crossing itself took months. Drake moved south and west, picking up the prevailing winds that the Portuguese had used for generations to drive their ships from Asia back toward Europe, the great circular wind patterns of the southern oceans that Vasco da Gama's pilots had worked out in the 1490s, and that had structured the Cape route ever since. There were no Spanish warships to worry about in these waters. Spain's Caribbean and Atlantic patrols were another ocean away, and news of Drake's Pacific raids would have been moving slowly overland through Spanish colonial channels, while the Golden Hind herself moved west. The threat was not naval here. It was the weather, the water supply, the condition of the hull, and the accumulated wear on a crew that had been at sea since late 1577. The Cape of Good Hope, when they reached it, represented a threshold. South Africa's southern tip was not a friendly anchorage. The Portuguese had designated the region and the Cape route itself as domain they controlled, and English ships were not welcome in any formal sense. But the Cape was also the hinge on which the Indian Ocean connected to the Atlantic, and clearing it meant transitioning from one of the longest and most dangerous legs of the circumnavigation into the final northward run up the Atlantic toward English waters. The Golden Hind rounded the Cape and turned north. The crew had been at sea for nearly 3 years. They had crossed 4 oceans, lost 4 ships, buried a significant portion of the men who had left Plymouth with them, fought a battle over authority that ended with an execution, and carried treasure of almost incomprehensible value through waters that had very nearly swallowed them permanently just months before. England was not close, but it was, for the first time since they had left, on the same ocean. The Golden Hind came into Plymouth harbour on September 26, 1580, nearly 3 years after she had left it. Drake's first question, reportedly, was whether the Queen was still alive. It was a practical concern, not a theatrical one. Everything that followed from the voyage depended on whose hands were holding power in England, because the cargo in his hold and the actions he had taken to acquire it were either a triumph or a criminal enterprise, depending entirely on how the Crown chose to read them. Elizabeth was alive, and she was interested. The cargo the Golden Hind brought back was staggering. Estimates vary, and the full accounting was conducted with deliberate opacity, but the silver and gold Drake had taken from Spanish ships and settlements along the Pacific coast, combined with the spices from the Moluccas, represented a return on the original investment that had no precedent in English maritime history. Some calculations have placed the total value at something close to half the annual revenues of the English crown. The investors who had backed the voyage quietly, including Elizabeth herself, stood to receive returns that made the losses of the 4 missing ships feel almost beside the point. Almost. The public reaction was immediate and uncontainable. Drake arrived in Plymouth, and the news moved fast. The story that circulated was not a careful, qualified account of a 3-year expedition that had departed with 5 ships and returned with 1. It was the story of a voyage that had gone around the world, the first Englishman to do it, the second captain in history to complete a circumnavigation after Magellan's expedition half a century earlier, and the first to survive and return in command of his own ship. That detail mattered. Magellan himself had died in the Philippines. Drake had sailed out, circled the world, and sailed home again. The achievement seized the popular imagination in a way that the specific financial and strategic dimensions of the venture did not need to explain. At court, the reception was more complicated, because at court everything involving Spain was complicated. Philip II was furious. The Spanish ambassador in London was pressing for Drake to be punished, for the treasure to be returned, for England to acknowledge that what had happened constituted piracy under any framework of law that both nations nominally respected. Elizabeth listened to these complaints with the careful attention of someone who had no intention of acting on them. She had backed the voyage. She knew what it had done. She was also aware that the diplomatic moment required a performance of consideration, a posture of weighing the Spanish case seriously before reaching conclusions that had already been reached. The balancing act Elizabeth performed in the months after Drake's return was one of the more elegant pieces of political theatre in a reign full of it. She could not immediately embrace Drake as a hero without openly declaring that England had sanctioned attacks on Spanish shipping and colonial settlements. That would have been an act of war at a moment when she was not yet ready to fight one openly. So the treasure was quietly unloaded and moved to the Tower of London. The full accounting was treated as a state matter, conducted in private. Drake himself was not immediately and publicly celebrated in the way that would have removed all diplomatic ambiguity. The Queen kept her options open, maintained the fiction that she was reviewing the situation, and simultaneously made clear to everyone around her that Francis Drake was a man she regarded with very high favour. The knighthood settled the question for history. In April of 1581, Elizabeth travelled to Deptford, where the Golden Hind had been brought and was riding at anchor. The ceremony was conducted on the deck of the ship. Elizabeth knighted Drake with a sword. One account suggests she handed the sword playfully to a French ambassador who was present and had him perform the actual dubbing, a way of implicating France in the honour and the implicit message it sent to Spain. Whether or not that detail is precise, the meaning of the event was unmistakable. The Queen had come to the ship in person. She had knighted the man who had raided Spain's Pacific Empire. Any remaining diplomatic pretense that England regarded these actions as unauthorized or regrettable was quietly buried under the weight of the ceremony itself. The Golden Hind was preserved after the knighthood, ordered maintained at Deptford as a monument. People came to see it. It became an attraction, a physical object that people could stand on and touch, a piece of the world that Drake had carried home with him. The ship itself became a legend as much as the man who had sailed her. For decades afterward it sat at Deptford, slowly deteriorating despite the official designation of preservation, but serving during that time as a tangible anchor for the story England was telling itself about what the voyage had meant. Souvenirs were made from its timber. The image of the ship circulated in prints and illustrations. The Golden Hind was a symbol before it was fully a ruin. What the returning ship did to the memory of the four that had not returned was, in effect, to erase them. The story that entered public consciousness was not the story of a fleet that had mostly failed to complete its mission. It was the story of the one ship that had the Pelican, the Elizabeth, the Marigold, the Swan, the Christopher. Their names do not appear in the popular version of the circumnavigation. The men who died on the Marigold in the storms below Tierra del Fuego, the crew of the Elizabeth who turned back and reached England months before Drake did, the scattered survivors of an expedition that had departed as a fleet and been reduced by weather and attrition and command decisions to a single vessel. Their experience was absorbed into the larger narrative and largely disappeared within it. This is what triumph does to complicated history. Drake came home with a ship full of silver and the claim of having circled the world, and England took the achievement and made it simple. One ship, One captain, one circumnavigation. The cost of the voyage, measured in ships and men, and the decisions that had been made at Port St. Julian and in the storms south of the continent, was not the story anyone wanted to tell. The Golden Hind riding at anchor in Deptford, with Elizabeth standing on its deck holding a sword, was the image that endured. What had been lost along the way remained mostly at the bottom of the world. The knighthood at Deptford was a ceremony about the past, but what it announced was a future. England in 1581 was not yet a naval empire. It was an island kingdom with ambitions that had repeatedly run into the harder reality of Spanish power, Spanish wealth, and Spanish control over the sea routes that connected Europe to the rest of the world. Drake's voyage did not end that imbalance, but it fundamentally altered how England thought about the imbalance, and in the long run, what a nation believes is possible shapes what it eventually attempts. Before the Golden Hind returned, the Pacific was a Spanish lake. That was not a metaphor. It was an operational assumption built into the entire structure of Spain's American empire. The treasure that came out of Peru and the silver mines of Potosi moved up the Pacific coast to Panama, crossed the isthmus overland, and loaded onto Atlantic fleets. The Pacific side of that system had almost no defences, because none were considered necessary. No hostile ship had ever penetrated it. The ports had no walls worth the name. The vessels carrying silver were not armed warships. The assumption of security had been so total and so long unchallenged that it had become architectural. The towns Drake sacked, the ships he plundered, their vulnerability was not an oversight. It was the product of a world in which no one had imagined the threat. Drake proved the imagination had been wrong. After 1580, Spain could no longer treat the Pacific as a protected interior. The fortifications that were subsequently built at Callao and along the coast, the armed escorts that began accompanying treasure ships, the naval presence that had to be established in waters where none had existed, all of that was a direct response to what one English ship had done on a single voyage. Drake cost Spain not just the treasure he had taken, but the ongoing expense of defending against the possibility of another Drake. That is a different kind of damage, and it does not appear on any ledger from the Golden Hind's cargo hold. For England, the voyage opened what might best be called a strategic imagination. The investors and courtiers and naval planners, who absorbed the meaning of what Drake had done, began thinking about empire differently. The idea that English ships could operate in the Pacific, could reach the Spice Islands, could establish trade or claim territory in places Spain had assumed were permanently under its control. That idea had been theoretical before 1580 and was proven possible after it. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, was built on commercial logic, but also on the demonstrated fact that English vessels could survive the passage to the Far East and return with something worth the journey. The Elizabethan privateering wars of the 1580s and 1590s were fought with a confidence about English maritime capability that Drake's circumnavigation had done significant work to establish. The voyage also belongs to a specific and important chapter in the history of how humans came to understand the shape of the world. Drake's transit of the Strait of Magellan and his subsequent experience in the storms that drove the Golden Hind south of Tierra del Fuego had genuine geographic consequence. The open water Drake found south of the continental tip, what would eventually carry his name as Drake Passage, challenged and eventually revised the prevailing assumption that a great southern landmass connected the tip of South America to a continent circling the bottom of the globe. The information his voyage contributed fed into the slow revision of world maps that characterized the late 16th and early 17th centuries, a period in which European knowledge of the actual dimensions and configurations of the Earth was being corrected voyage by voyage, sometimes at enormous human cost. And that cost is where the full reckoning of the voyage has to land, because nothing about its legacy sits cleanly on the side of achievement. The raids on the Pacific coast were not conducted against abstractions. The towns Drake's men entered, the ships they stopped and stripped, the people who encountered the expedition as something terrifying arriving without warning, those were real. The Spanish colonial system Drake was dismantling through plunder was itself built on violence, on the forced labour of enslaved indigenous and African people, on conquest. But the dismantling did not free anyone. The silver Drake took from those ships had been pulled from the earth by people who had no say in the matter, and it passed from one European power's hands to another's and ended up in the Tower of London, while the people who had mined it remained where they were. The name Francis Drake carries very different meanings depending on where in the world you encounter it. In England and in the English-speaking tradition that followed, he is the circumnavigator, the sea captain who stood on the deck at Deptford while the Queen raised her sword. In the Caribbean, in the coastal communities of Peru and Chile, in the histories that descend from the people his ships encountered, the same man appears in a different register. The violence and plunder that produced the cargo in his hold are not secondary details in those accounts. They are the account. A full history of the voyage has to hold both of these versions, not because the achievement cancels the harm or the harm cancels the achievement, but because both are true, and the story does not actually make sense without them. What the voyage changed, finally, was the terms on which England entered the world. Not immediately, not without subsequent failure and reversal, but irreversibly. The mental map that English merchants, sailors, monarchs and adventurers carried after 1580 had been permanently enlarged by what a single ship had done. The oceans were not closed. The distant coasts were reachable. The empires already planted in those places were not immune. These were lessons that England would spend the following centuries acting on, with consequences that stretched far beyond anything Drake or Elizabeth or the investors who backed the voyage could have anticipated or intended. The story matters beyond Drake, because Drake was a demonstration, not a conclusion. He showed what was possible, what England and then Britain chose to do with that possibility, the empire that followed, the world it remade and the damage it caused in the remaking. That is the longer story the Golden Hind sailed into without knowing it. 5 ships left Plymouth in 1577. 1 came back. After everything that has been covered across this voyage, that ratio deserves a direct answer. Not a single cause, but an honest accounting of how the fleet was dismantled piece by piece, and why the story that survived was so thoroughly shaped by the one ship that made it home. The losses were not random. They followed a pattern that reveals something real about the nature of the voyage itself. The Christopher was exchanged early, a practical trade rather than a disaster. The Swan was broken up for timber and parts, when the fleet could no longer sustain 5 vessels with the crews available. Those losses were decisions, not accidents. Drake actively consolidating his resources in response to attrition he could already see accumulating. By the time the fleet reached the Strait of Magellan, it had already contracted by design. What happened after the strait was different. The Marigold went down in the storms south of Tierra del Fuego, almost certainly with all hands, swallowed by weather so severe that Drake's own ship was driven to latitudes no European vessel had recorded. That was not strategy. That was the ocean winning. The Elizabeth survived the same storm, turned around and sailed home. Her captain made a choice that was arguably reasonable given what he knew, which was that the flagship had been scattered and the passage south looked unsurvivable. He did not know Drake had survived. He could not have known. So the Elizabeth returned to England and her captain reported what he believed to be true, and what he believed was that the expedition had likely been destroyed. That belief, stated plainly, explains a great deal about the historical record. The narrative of Drake's voyage is almost entirely Drake's narrative. The men on the Elizabeth left accounts, but those accounts describe a voyage that turned back. They are not the story of a circumnavigation. They are the story of a retreat. The official record, the celebrated version, the story that became legend. It belongs to the Golden Hind because only the Golden Hind completed the journey. The missing ships are missing from the history for the same reason they are missing from the Pacific. They did not reach the places where the memorable things happened. The captures, the raids, the Spice Islands, the crossing of the Indian Ocean. None of that entered the record from any vessel other than one. When a single ship is the only source, the surviving narrative becomes identical to the triumphant one, and every other version of events exists only in fragments, in Spanish reports, in court proceedings, in the brief testimony of men who turned back and had to explain why. What remains permanently uncertain is significant. We do not know with confidence exactly what the Marigold's final hours looked like, who survived longest, or whether any account from her crew made it to land. We do not know the full scope of what Drake's men experienced in portions of the voyage where the Golden Hind's own logs are incomplete or were deliberately suppressed by a crown that had reasons to keep certain details vague. We do not know precisely where Drake anchored on the North American coast, what he promised or implied to the people he met there, or how accurately any of it was recorded. The voyage produced geographical knowledge that shaped maps for generations, but the knowledge itself arrived already filtered through the purposes of the men who controlled the telling. What we do know is that the reduction from 5 ships to 1 was not a failure wearing the costume of success. It was adaptation under conditions that would have ended most expeditions entirely. Drake lost vessels, redistributed men, changed objectives, pushed further when others stopped, and returned with enough silver to pay every investor and still leave a surplus that reportedly exceeded what the Crown collected in taxes that year. The question of why only 1 ship came back has 2 answers that coexist without contradiction. Because the voyage was extraordinarily dangerous, and because the man leading it was extraordinarily determined to complete it regardless of what that required. The circumnavigation sits at the intersection of survival story and imperial blueprint, and that is not a coincidence. The same qualities that kept the Golden Hind moving when every other vessel in the fleet had turned back or gone under, the willingness to adapt, to consolidate, to absorb loss and continue, are precisely the qualities that made the voyage a model for what followed. England did not build its maritime empire by sending fleets that always came home intact. It built it by learning from the ones that did come home, extracting the lesson from the wreckage, and sailing again. 1 ship returned. That was enough to change what England thought was possible. And changing what a nation thinks is possible is, in the long run, the thing that changes everything else.